Hello, and welcome to the 9 p.m. Live. Now, I understand that yesterday we were having some technical difficulties, mainly because of the Wi-Fi. Nobody could hear me. It was super glitchy, and so nothing I said got across. But I was saying, I think, some important things, and the work that I was discussing yesterday continues tonight. So I'm going to recap what folks couldn't hear last night, tonight, and then we'll talk about a few other things. But before we get into what we were talking about last night, which is the Democratic State Committee, some looming votes coming up. One about the DNC, one about how to change the composition of the DNC, or at least New York State's delegation, and one about the electors that will be selecting the president, which are chosen again by the state committees of the various parties. Before we get into that, since folks are still jumping on, I just want to cover two things in the news, which are basically the same thing, or two halves of a pretty grim story. Now, we've spoken a lot about how our elected officials are doing a piss poor job of creating and passing legislation to actually help the people and workers of the United States. But it gets a little bit worse than the fact that Congress happens to be ignoring the fact that individuals are hurting and that corporate tax cuts aren't going to be the solution to the pandemic, and that telling people to go back to work when they've done nothing to mitigate the effects of the virus is no long-term strategy towards reviving the economy. The internet was garbage last night. What happened? I don't know. I don't control the internet. Ben, I finally got the Biden job, by the way. Congratulations, Dorian. Tell us what it is that you'll be doing for Joe Biden. That being said, while Dorian types that out, I want to talk about these two articles. One article came out in the Washington Post saying that during the pandemic, work hours have gone up by 45 minutes on average, and the number of meetings have increased. Now, you might say we've all saved 45 minutes on commuting, so that sort of nets out, and the meetings are more numerous but shorter, so perhaps that nets out as well. But what we can absolutely say is that employers are getting used to the idea, at least for those, the employers of those who still have work, employers are getting used to the idea of having constant access to their employees and having those extra 45 minutes of productive time. So even once this pandemic downgrades, and we'll see if we ever get there in the United States, this is going to have a long-term consequence on the way that the employee-employer relationship plays out in terms of time and accessibility. Because now they're all aware that you can, of course, be doing work at home. The other big trend, which had an article published today, is that millions of people, even though working hours are up, millions of people have lost their jobs, and there's an estimate that 40% of those jobs aren't coming back. Because as retail workers are laid off, as jobs which can be replaced by robots and AI and self-service are being laid off, companies are implementing these robotic AI solutions. And this has momentous, tremendous, gigantic, gargantuan consequences for the future of our economy as we come out of this pandemic. Taken as a whole, everything seems to be pointing in a single direction, that workers will be facing a serious squeeze over the next 10 years. Now, if that sounds implausible, or you want a sense of what that could look like, well, over the previous 30 years, wages have been effectively stagnant. Since basically the 1980s, worker wages have remained stagnant as a share. Well, they've remained stagnant, and their share as a percentage of GDP has gone down, whereas there's been a skyrocketing on the return to capital. Now, what this all implies is that the folks who own capital, and we tend to think of that as buildings and stuff, but it includes things like intellectual property and software. You see, all of the value of the economy is being shifted towards capital. So the returns to capitalists are going up, 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 which is why the top 1% of our country is just running away with almost all of the economic growth and economic gains, because they were the capitalists to begin with. And now the returns on capital so far outstrip the return to labor that they're pulling away as wages remain stagnant. Now, I won't get into all this theory, this economic theory about how productivity is supposed to increase worker compensation. That simply hasn't been happening. So actually that theory is totally bunk anyway, as far as I'm concerned. I find economists have a pretty bad time trying to figure out which variables are correlated and which variables are actually independent. But ultimately, the increase of productivity of some workers, basically through extra hours and through working additional time. Actually, it's not an increase in productivity. That's simply an increase in time spent. Productivity would mean doing more with less time. So the increase in time that workers are putting in to produce value for the business owners, and the degree to which business owners are cutting the workforce to replace it with capital, means that the folks who own the businesses and the folks who own the capital, which is to say the robot manufacturing plants, the intellectual property that makes up the AI, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and the, I guess, pick your manufacturer, Tesla, GE. Well, GE is kind of terrible, but what have you. I mean, they're not doing very well. But the pandemic is accelerating trends which are going to be which have been predicted, and Andrew Yang spoke about this a lot, predicted to put the hurt on workers into the future, but it's all being squished into a very short time frame, particularly in the United States, because the United States is doing nothing to make it easier for workers to actually return to work. So companies, seeing that they will have a diminished workforce into the future because the United States is doing less to make it safe for people to actually show up for business, the United States is going to be investing proportionately more in these innovative technologies that eliminate jobs. Now, in one sense, we could say that's great. The pandemic in the short term is a catastrophe, but if we do it right, in the long run, it will have been the incentive to massively upgrade and digitize the US economy, because America had to move to a model of robotic services before all of the rest of the world, simply because the government did nothing to make the outside spaces safe for humans. But even if we said that that were a good thing, which I am absolutely not saying, what it also implies is that whether or not we move at an accelerated rate towards a robotized and AI-tized future, or we move at the same rate that we were moving before, without changes to the structure of capitalism and the way that returns are generated and the accumulation of wealth, it's going to lead to an even grosser stratification of wealth and power in this country than we've seen even already. Now, mind you, during the pandemic, hundreds, thousands of businesses have gone under, and many, many people have lost their jobs and their income. But at the same time, a few billionaires have made effectively $1 trillion through skyrocketing stocks. That is something we're going to see, believe it or not, accelerate as the AI and the machinery they produce takes over more and more of the economy as workers are drained out of the equation. So that capital eats up jobs, and then the returns that labor would have gotten in the form of wages now go as returns to capital. It's honestly a super dangerous situation. And we've spoken about my dystopian view for the future, in which there's this intense stratification that basically creates a permanent underclass of people, very much as in Kurt Vonnegut's book, Play Your Piano, and the political will to challenge these capitalists is non-existent because they have so much money and power. And the rest of the population is basically kept complacent through UBI, which to me is terrifying, because I would much rather have no UBI and a restless population that is constantly striving to balance out the power of the small oligarchy, which seems to be taking over the country, and reestablishing and reasserting the right of individual to have a role in governance through democracy. But I don't know. We're at a deep, deep inflection point in human history. I think we see this all, people talk about Donald Trump as being an inflection point, and Donald Trump is an inflection point, but he's part of a larger inflection point because the things that led to Donald Trump are the trends that I'm talking about: the stagnation of wages, the lack of the value of work, the disparate outcomes for an upper class and a middle and lower class, a middle class evaporating, a lower class getting lower, which makes people feel trapped in their situation, which enables for the political scapegoating. This political economy, and I do say political economy because economics is not separate from politics. What we do with economic surplus, that is to say, the extra value of production that is beyond subsistence, what we do with that is a political question. Do we let capitalists keep that money as returns on investment? Do we encourage or allow the limitation of the labor force to drive wages up? Do we have a government that taxes and redistributes wealth? These are all political questions. So the idea of economics is not separate from the idea of politics, because even in a capitalist market-driven system, the government is there to set the rules of the market and ensure that they function. But this political economy has given rise to the anger and the fear that gives rise to political scapegoating, which is what's led to the leadership of Donald Trump. And we'll see where we go from here. And we'll see what Joe Biden pulls out. But I don't think that Joe Biden really recognizes this problem. I think Elizabeth Warren might, which is why I supported her in the primary. But this is the problem of the day: wealth inequality, and not just wealth inequality, but the structural reality of our economy that produces wealth inequality by deeply, deeply privileging capital in a moment in history when capital is about to replace all other forms of productivity through machination paired with artificial intelligence. Deep stuff, folks. Deep stuff. Dorian, you never told us what job you got with Joe Biden. And also, if folks can hear me, or if you can't hear me, let me know. I feel like my internet's probably good right now because nobody's complaining. So that's good. In any event, I just want to talk for a few minutes now about what we're working on in the state committee, because having just spoken about the importance of political economy, the political parties that make up the bulk of our politics have a very large, thank you, so now I know people can hear me, make up a very large part of the decision-making ecosystem when it comes to that political economy. And so I happen to be in the Democratic Party and an elected leader in the Democratic Party, and we're obviously going into a giant national election. Now, a lot of folks are really upset about the fact that it looks like the Democratic Party platform isn't going to see any truly major progressive overhauls or overhauls in any direction, because the convention is being held virtually and the delegates are not going to be given a lot of voice. Not to mention the fact that Bernie Sanders doesn't have quite enough delegates to force a floor fight on any of these matters. So that being said, the next big push to reform and improve the way that the Democratic Party as a political body responds to the needs of actual voters and people on the ground is the DNC, which makes up the leadership body of the national party. So there's the DNC Democratic National Convention and the DNC Democratic National Committee. I know it's a bit confusing, but insofar as the convention is going to happen and we probably won't see too much action out of it, the committee, which meets twice every year at a minimum, whereas the convention only meets once every 4 years, will become a major part of establishing the democratic political framework. And so those elections are coming up in September, and tonight I'm going to be working to finalize a change to the state party bylaws, which will require, one, that we have geographic representation, or that it's a bit complicated. We want to have relatively fair representation across all of New York State in our delegation, which the state committee elects to go to the DNC. But we have no way of knowing what the composition of the delegation currently is. We basically, as the progressives, the reformers, we had to go look up all of the members of the DNC, and then we had to go try to figure out where they all came from. As it turns out, everybody except for one person comes from New York City or Long Island. This means that upstate, where honestly Democrats have a hard time, and we really do need voices to inform the party of how to reach out to folks in less urban areas, those voices are stifled. So we're looking to write a set of rules that will require the party to A, inform us of the geographic composition of the delegation, B, the ethnic composition of the delegation. Right now, we also happen to know that it's about 30% African American and like 70% white, which is kind of in proportion to the population of African Americans in New York State, but wildly out of proportion to the population of white folk. We should have at least 12 to 15% Latinx, and we should, or Latino, I don't know, there's a big debate about that. Don't at me, please. I'm Asian. And we should have 10% Asian. But we don't. We have no representation from either of those groups. So we should have at least one Asian and at least 2 or 3 Hispanic folk. I don't know if that's an okay word either, but I don't know. Progressive lingo just moves so quickly these days. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments so that I can continue to be, operate at my best. So in any event, that's one part of it. The other part of it is, even though the state committee is meant to elect these DNC representatives, we have had a dilly of a time, and I've tried on many occasions, we've had a dilly of a time trying to figure out how our representatives have been voting and whether or not they've been attending these DNC meetings. It's a big issue. What if I told you it's time to have an election? You've got to vote for your Congress member, but I won't tell you any of the stances they've taken on any legislation, and I won't tell you whether or not they showed up for their job. How are you supposed to make an informed decision? Well, this is something we want the state party to acquire. The chair is a member of the DNC and can get the roles. Mind you, many of us, myself included, have tried to reach out to the DNC to get the roll call votes, to get the voting results, and the attendance records. And they simply say that's only available to the DNC members, which is, I think, ridiculous. But that's what they tell us. One of the first times I tried to do this was when, this is actually the second time, but I can't remember why I did it the first time, was when the DNC voted against holding a climate change debate. And so we wanted to see how the New York delegation voted on that. Now, I did end up getting the vote tally, but not from New York. I had to find it from somebody who I believe was in California. Not great. Not good for transparency, not good for voter confidence, and not good for casting votes when it comes to representation of our state. So this is a resolution, again, not a resolution, a bylaws change that I'll be working on tonight, because we basically need to submit it by Sunday. So I got my work cut out for me. Of course, I still have my ethics proposal that's still on the docket, which I'm super excited to have brought up. This is, again, an ethics rules change to create an independent ethics process, to add sexual harassment and misconduct as being against the bylaws of the Democratic Party, and to extend the ethics responsibilities to the executive board of the state committee and all of the state committee members. Right now, it's a very limited subset. So these are some of the things we're working on. And we've got our DNC member elections in September. Now, before that, one of the things, this is the last thing I want to mention. Before that, at the end of this month, August 25th, when hopefully we'll be passing these new rules that I've authored and a couple of ones that other folks have authored, we're going to be electing the electors. Now, I just want to, it doesn't make a huge difference who the electors are, because largely they're not actually bound. You can have these Hamiltonian electors, but the Democratic Party electors are super unlikely to break ranks and vote for Donald Trump, regardless of what happens. But if you ever wondered how electors end up being chosen to then vote for president, because of course we don't popularly elect the president, we have an electoral college. If you were wondering how that happens, the political parties of each state, the state committees, all select slates of electors. And it's very much like the delegates to the convention. When you vote for president, you're actually electing the slate of delegates. You're actually casting your vote for the slate of delegates from that presidential candidate's political party. And that way, the number of electors that get chosen is proportional to the popular vote in the state for the, actually, I take it back. It's not proportional to the popular vote. It is by congressional district, winner take all. You know, it's just the dumbest thing in the world. But so it's actually winner take all. So if a presidential candidate wins 50% of a state, they get all of the electors, I think, as many of us are familiar. I won't, I guess I bungled the explanation a bit, but, it's basically a winner take all system. 50% plus one wins you all of the electors in a state. I won't go much more into the mechanics of the electoral college, though, because I think most folks know it. But the way you become an elector is you run and you are chosen by the party members, the state committee members of the presidential candidate's political party. And so the Democrats and the Republicans and all those folks, they decide who the electors will be. And again, it's mainly an honorary thing. The electors are very much expected to go with how the vote goes. But, it would be nice if electors simply refused to do that and always voted with the breakdown of the popular vote in their state. But obviously, these are all the whole point of having the parties select these people is that they'll all be partisan hacks and they'll always vote for their party and not for, the ideal of popular rule. Anyway, that's that. Simon Sack, can you send me a copy of your ethics amendment? Yes, I think I actually posted it on my timeline. I posted both of the resolutions I introduced at the last state committee, including the ethics package, which will be voted on at the next state committee meeting. That was all, I guess, a week or two ago I posted that up, but I'll post it again, and I'll send it to you. Yes, sure, no problem. I have a few people who have asked for it, so I will send it out. But with that, I think that's pretty much all the questions, and I've sort of covered what I wanted to talk about tonight. So what's today? Thursday? Friday's tomorrow? I'll see you all tomorrow at 9 p.m. Until then.